Hello, and welcome to another episode of Leader Generation brought to you by ModUp. Today I'm joined by Joseph Miller. He's the Chief AI Officer and co-founder of Vivun. We're really excited to get into this conversation and explore the role of expert knowledge in the age of AI. We know that a lot of leaders are exploring or struggling really with what is their role as AI proliferates through their job, through the roles and skills of their teams, and changes the way they take their products and services to market. How do we reimagine how we reconnect with our target accounts, with lead generation, and all of the other tools that we have at our disposal to start to bring our knowledge to bear value for those that we serve? Joseph, thank you so much for joining us today. Very excited to hear about your journey and your insight. So let's get into it.
All right, thanks for having me.
So, you are a serial entrepreneur. You have founded many different types of companies, and now you're at Vivun. Tell us a little bit about your journey and your role at Vivun today.
Thank you. So I got brought into Vivun through John Bruce, who's another one of the co-founders. John and I actually have a pretty rich history of trying to create companies ourselves, taking me all the way back to mid 2000s, really. We were both out in Berkeley at that time, and I'm actually a physicist by training, and so I was studying physics and economics there, and then I was working as a nuclear physicist at the National Lab, building particle simulations and trying to do predictive analytics and these types of things. And we were all into tech, and so we were trying to build out different things throughout really our entire adult careers here. And Vivun came along and it was one of the projects that actually ended up working out for us. So it was exciting because when John called me, it was really in his domain. He was it is we started out in pre-sales, focusing in that space. And Matt Darrow, the CEO and co-founder as well, also has a rich history in pre-sales. And by the time that came around, I was pretty deep into building expert knowledge systems and trying to build AIs that represent, like the processes and the ways of thinking of managers and executives and scientists of different places and all kinds of stuff like that. And I didn't really have a lot of experience in pre-sales, but it was interesting to me because of that reason. I didn't really have a lot of experience in it, but I had, been a musician, I had been a scientist, I had been a different business leader in different places. And so I had seen that, like, the way that you represent expert knowledge and the way that you think about codifying best practices and things like that, and trying to build systems to deliver that value, was really an abstract thing from the domain. And so when I saw pre-sales, I said, "Hey, I don't know anything about this. That excites me." And we knew what we wanted to do here. We wanted to take Matt's and John's expert knowledge in that system, or in that domain, and codify that into a system that we can deliver as a product. And so that's how we got going on Vivun, initially. And I think it was interesting because the early days of, like mostly all of the early 2000s and the mid 2000s as well, there was like this sort of proliferation of dashboards. And like, this is what SaaS really was like effectively a bunch of dashboards and integrations and such. And if you thought about why was that the way that software was sort of developing, dashboard is a sort of form of representing expert knowledge. You have to a priori sort of know, what are you going to show the users? What are you going to deliver? How are you going to frame these charts? What is the narratives in all the pages and such, that you're actually allowing them to go explore their own data and answer questions that they're, trying to make decisions on and such. And what was interesting with this was around the same time, while we founded Vivun, and I think it started, I think, founded in 2017 maybe, or 16, Matt Darrow, and then John joined a year later, and then I joined a year later, and then we raised our seed round. And while that was happening, I was actually at Bridgewater Associates, working on a team that reported to Ray Dalio himself, building an expert system for him. So I was really interested in this way of trying to do exactly what we were trying to do at Vivun, but in a different domain, in finance. And so when we got together, that was basically what happened. That's how we got it kicked off. A bunch of the team from Bridgewater, I was very fortunate for a lot of the engineers that worked for me there, followed me over into Vivun, and that's sort of how we got it kicked off. But it was always rooted in this idea of expert knowledge systems, trying to deliver, trying to represent the best domain knowledge, the best ways of thinking about working through a deal and all of that, and then deliver that up to the user. And in those days, in 2018 or whatever it was, we didn't have good LLMs. And while we were using some LLMs actually in our early products, we have patents on using the early days of LLMs before they were any good, really. So Vivun has always been on the edge of that, but you couldn't engage with that information naturally. And so the LLM revolution, if you will, in 2020 and 2021 was like the big aha moment for Vivun. Like we had sort of laid the foundation of expert knowledge, and now we finally had a way to engage with that. And that to me is really what the pivot that not only Vivun, but I think every company is sort of going through at this moment.
Yeah, and you said a couple of things that are really big unlocked, especially when we think about the pre-sales change in behavior that's happening right now. Like we work with Forrester, I feel like they say that all the time. And one of the studies they released shows that there the buying cycle and the buying process is evolving from that 7 to 8 people involved in a buying decision, like at an enterprise level, to buying networks. And there are influencers in that networks, and there are different people. And it's really no longer the recipe that you have a single salesperson and everything sort of revolves around that specific salesperson's knowledge of the product, their contacts, their Rolodex. Like the role of the salesperson is still important, but they can't be on like 24/7. And there is no way humans can have 100% of all the knowledge that the company has, that the engineers have, that the product people have behind it. Like the amount of expertise that is in any company has almost this opportunity to get out into the world into a very different way. How does Vivun play a role with that salesperson today in getting the most value out of the company's expertise and the other sales leaders and marketing leaders at the company?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's like it is. There's sort of something very fundamental about expert knowledge that is that sometimes people call it like tribal knowledge in a company. Like what has the company as almost like an organism has learned that no one person knows all the pieces of. But then there's also like business processes, like we call it procedural knowledge. Like how do you work through a deal? What is the way that the company has established that works for that company's sales cycle or whatever the goal, the decision that they're trying to make. It may be a sales thing, maybe a hiring thing, right? Could be any number of things that companies have come up with saying like, this is how we go about doing this work. And there's lots of kinds of knowledge like that I think that it'd help if we go back a little bit and just understand like that sort of concept right there is that there's different kinds of knowledge that is held up. Like people tend to think of that the only knowledge is sort of like the Library of Congress kind of knowledge or something like, ChatGPT knows all the books in the Library of Congress. And so it's very smart. And you're like, that's not really what we mean when we think of intelligence. That's not really what we mean when we think about expert knowledge. It's not just declarative facts of this person is working that deal or this is the pain point on that project. It's what you do with all of that information. It's like, what does it imply about what you ought to go do? And that word ought is a very, very heavy word. That suggests that there is some world model that pre-exists the knowledge or the declarative knowledge that you go find out when you're working through a deal. And that world model doesn't exist in an LLM. It just doesn't emerge out of people debate whether or not there's emergent LLMs. But expert knowledge that we define it as is that is a world model that are saying, what are the things that are important in this company? And it might be in the sales cycle, like what are the concepts that are important about working through a deal? And how are they related to each other? And what's interesting about companies is that if you force ranked all of your best salespeople in a line, more often than not, your best salespeople sort of have a richer world model of like what are the things that are important, how are they interestingly connected, and what does it imply about working a deal. Like they pivot faster, they understand what right questions to ask. When you think about what those types of actions are, it sort of betrays the need for this thing. Knowing what you don't know is a very, very powerful skill. And that is what that word ought means. It means that I ought to know this. If I want to answer this question excellently, I must know these five things. If I do not know one of them, I can't do it. Now, if you ask an LLM, of course, it will just do its best with the four things that it does know, right? Because it has no world model. It doesn't know that, at least in your company or in your business process, that that fifth thing is a necessary condition for you to be able to answer the question excellently or run it through the business process. And so when you think about what do companies have, this tribal knowledge, this expert knowledge across their product, across their product managers, their engineers, their salespeople, how do you aggregate all of that and make it accessible to each of the people, to each human in any given role? That is sort of the power that I think AI is really bringing now. If you establish a world model of what's important, ask the LLM to go organize the unstructured data of the world, put it into this world model. Now this can converse with any different role in your company. And that's really the powerful revolution that I think is happening right now.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you're hitting on something that is determinant of success when using AI, as opposed to trying to build an model or an AI solution or tool internally to eliminate time, to make things more productive. Like we hear a lot of roles of AI today, and a lot of it is efficiency. We let go of X number of people. We started a new revenue line because we productize something that's using AI. But we were talking about before we started recording the study done by MIT, and people go back and forth on that study because it was 54 respondents, but it got a lot of buzz. And
Yeah.
there's no doubt that one, we're in a cycle of a ton of news media giving a lot of attention to headlines where things are failing, people are getting fired, like, and how can people, and what you've just given, I think is much more empowering. Look at the knowledge you have. Like every company that is completely within the power I have as a marketer, I have in any role I'm playing at the company. And what is that special sauce? But
Right.
how can we break through the hype and focus on that? And is this different than hype cycles in the past of other technologies that have um, launched?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that this paper has made a ton of rounds, and I think the reason that it's catching on is because there's this deep suspicion amongst business leaders that this is like the dot-com bust, or like there is a bubble that's happening, and I think that's probably like collinear with a lot of like market hype that is happening as well. So there's sort of confounding factors that are boiling in our minds. And we're asking ourselves, is this thing real? Is AI actually going to do labor substitution? Are we actually going to be able to replace people to do it? My answer to that is absolutely. It is already happening. I think that the first thing in the labor disruption is that it's a little bit like population collapse. Like there's a lot of population collapse demographically across the world. And people tend to think like, oh, the disaster means like there's going to be a mass death that happens. And that's not the way populations collapse. That's not the way that the labor market's going to collapse. It actually collapses that there is a giant decrease in births. And so in the business world, that would be akin to we are not going to hire as many people. So already I know a lot of business executives that are doing that. They have plans that are saying, I've already reduced my hiring budget over the next 2 to 5 years by 50%. Well, you're like, that's 50% less labor that is expected to come online from humans, anyways, over the next 5 years. And you're like, that is how it's actually going to happen. It's going to happen through this attrition and not replacement mechanism. And that will also give the AI time to get more practical and overcome the I think the rightful critiques of the MIT study. And then on that point is that I think the best way to understand why that hype cycle is happening, why are businesses failing to deliver practical value out of AI, is not because the hype is not real. I think the hype is very real. I think that it is real. Like this is actually happening this time. This time is different. People that have worked in AI for their careers, like I have, it is it is very apparent that this time is different. The tools that we have available to ourselves is just enormously more competent. Now they're not all, it's not AGI, right? Like that's what people are expecting, is that like, oh, I could just throw a wrapper around ChatGPT and ChatGPT can go sell my product. And you're like, yeah, that's not going to happen. But if you understand why that doesn't happen, then you actually understand all the technology exists for that to actually happen. You're not actually waiting for another innovation. You just have to architect it differently. And I would say to leaders that are asking, well, what is the right way to architect it? I would say what you need to do is look at the failure modes of these projects, of these 95% of projects that are failing within your own company or your own efforts. Why are they struggling? Look at the failure modes of those, and they will give you the clue of what's going on. So typical failure modes of LLMs would be things like ambiguity in language, hidden confounders, like something causes both things and the LLM doesn't actually have a world model that can reason causally, so it doesn't know that there's a third option that's going on. Multi-hop reasoning, why can't it do that? Why does it seem like it's thinking, but it's producing a chain of thought that looks legitimate, but then like can arrive at very bizarre or very absurd conclusions? When you break that down, this takes a little bit more philosophy, but like to bring everybody back to the like logic 101 courses, there's basically three things you need to do to have to accept a conclusion. The first is that you have to have very clear terms. You have to know what you mean when you say a particular word. You combine those terms to form premises, and your premises have to be true, right? So there's some truthiness to a premise. And then you can combine multiple premises together in a valid way. This is where fallacies come about, right? But if you have a valid construction of your premises, then you have to accept the conclusion. So that's how you get to truth. So now when you look at LLMs, you say, well, how come they arrive at all of these crazy things? You can point to one of those things. Ah, it thinks the word is different. This happens in sales and domain knowledge all the time. Like for example, I always use this example, but if you ask ChatGPT 5, hey, who is the user of my product and who is the buyer, it will often confuse those two things. They think it's the same thing. Well, of course it does, because in most cases, the buyer is the user of the product. But in sales, these are very, very, in B2B sales, like those are two different people. They're like very, very often in two different departments. So we mean these things different. Like, what is a saboteur in when you're running a deal? Who is your champion? Like, these are terms that have domain specific meaning and jargon to them that the LLM will often get wrong, because that's not the overall representation of the training data of that use of that term. So your terms can get very ambiguous. So that's one reason that it can fail. The second is that premises can be false because, again, you have domain specific things that are about your little niche. Like, oh, security is a good example. Like a lot of times, people will have a product that does like monitoring, like security monitoring, and then a separate product that will do prevention. These are different things. But if you ask an LLM, it will think, well, obviously, if you're monitoring risks, you're trying to prevent it. And so it thinks these are the same product. And you're like, they're not the same product. These are different things. They're different SKUs, different line items. They sell in different ways. So LMs get confused about that. And then of course there's this multi-hop reasoning problem, which has to do with the nature of the way LLMs quote unquote think, which is autoregressive. It's the next token prediction. And sure, there's like, nonlinearities, there's all kinds of stuff about the context of these things. But the reality is that it's forming structures, it's forming arguments, and if it gets one of the arguments false, the next argument, that is an input into the next argument. And so I always use an example of like, it's like if you leave New York on a flight to San Francisco and you're a degree off. Well, like if you're only actually flying to Newark, then yeah, you'll probably still make it. It'll be fine. But if you're flying to San Francisco, you're going to land in Alaska. Like you're going to be way off by the time you get there. So the longer the reasoning chain is, the worse this thing will do. And often in the case of like very human endeavors, like sales is a very human nature thing. It's a very ambiguous, we call it like high entropy domain. There's lots of little edge cases. Everything is basically an edge case. That is just you're gonna have to do a lot of chained reasoning. And if you just ask the LLM to do it for you, you're gonna find yourself in Alaska. So these sorts of things kind of betray what is actually going on in the language model and why it's not actually reasoning. It's not the way that you would, not the way that we mean when we say reasoning. We mean, sort of from a causal framework or from some sort of framework that this implies this, that implies that. There's no such thing in an LLM. There is no world model to imply the next thing. It's just a probabilistic model. So when you realize that and you say, the solution then is to build that model, is to have this world model outside of the LLM, then have the LLM integrate and integrate with that world model and we call it grounding. Like we ground the LLM in the world model, and then the world model handles the reasoning. So if something changes in this little node that's connected to this other node, a change here implies a change here. Or if this node if we have information about this one and we don't have information about that one, then it implies you have a question, right? The LLM should, or the agent should have a question. If it knows that it needs to know something that it doesn't know, that's a good definition of a question. So now your agent can be like, I need to ask the user this thing. And now you're getting very close to like actual, this is what a real human would do. This is the way we think. This is the way we operate in businesses. So now you're getting very close to that idea of like this is how labor substitution will eventually happen.
Yeah. So I love this answer. I'm going to break it apart a little bit for the audience
Sure.
because I know the majority of us are marketers. But I think if I were to like pull out some really important nuggets, you highlighted three different areas where challenges and problems, new challenges and problems we haven't had to solve in the past, are now present when we look at how we go to market. So if we want to use an AI tool, it doesn't mean give all the salespeople ChatGPT and that will help them with writing emails and cleaning up their pitches and maybe some other Gen AI that will do a PowerPoint. We are talking about if we want to get the most value and we don't want things to fail, we have to figure out what is that world model, which is logic and computation against knowledge that we need to pair with.
Yep.
And I think what we've seen is a lot of people are trying to measure the productivity gains that they're getting from issuing Copilot or ChatGPT
Yep.
and being like, oh my gosh, because when you first use it, it's like you go through this, you know, I don't know, bell curve of excitement. You're like, I don't really know if I'm using this right or if I'm getting any value. And then you do a little prompt engineering. You're like, holy crap, it take me, an hour to write these emails. Now I'm doing in minutes and I'm just copying and pasting. And you get really excited. And then someone asks you to take on more work, or someone asks or you are in a department where people are being eliminated and mostly prematurely because they're just looking at Excel sheets and trying to cut costs. And you're like, well, crap, now I have more work, more things to do. Did I really save time? And then we get in this stuck arena
Yep.
where I, if companies look at what are the new problems, the new challenges we need to solve for and bring on the right people, because that's where we also fall down. I think a lot of the listeners honestly might not have understood very much of what you just said, like technically be able to follow it. But I think the important takeaway is that's why you need to partner. And when you stand up durable teams that are working against an initiative, that it includes people from different disciplines, different skills, but for sure includes scientists and data scientists and data folks who maybe haven't had that frontline experience, as well as your frontline team members who have that knowledge, who are going to be a big part of what you want to codify. And
Yep.
um, Yeah, so I absolutely love that because I think there's the phrase you said earlier, knowing what you don't know. I mean, that sinks so many ships. When you don't acknowledge that there's a lot you don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like people are using ChatGPT and they're getting lift out of like helping them write emails or rewrite an outline or get going on, like every author says, like the first word is the hardest, right? So getting going. I think that there's a lot of help that, GPT or whatever LLM you want to use can help you, but that's all low stakes work. That's the point. It's like, yeah, it's getting you from New York to Newark, but like it can't get you to San Francisco. And the reason that you're hired is not for the low stake work. You're hired to do high stakes work. And that requires like a much higher bar of knowledge, of technical feasibility, all of that type of stuff. You got to know what you're trying to do. You have to have hypotheses that you're going to go out and test. You need to execute in a particular way because you might have a great idea, but then the execution is bad. And you're like, all of this type of stuff is like, there's many, many more failure modes once you start doing work that matters. And I think that's sort of the point that is coming around is that LLMs can't really help you get from New York to San Francisco. It's too high stakes, and there's just too many ways that it will fail to help you along that way. And then when you start to think like, okay, well, what is the gap between there? You're like, that's the expert knowledge. That is what the humans are good for. Being able to say what are the right questions to be asking, not just producing simulated reasoning responses that like look like they're pretty good, but then when you look at them pretty close, you're like, oh man, this is a mess. Like this isn't accurate, or like this isn't actually all that helpful to do anything meaningful. So yeah, that's what I think that's where like all AI work is going is when people are realizing this like hype it feels like a hype bubble popping because the practicality of doing meaningful high stakes work AIs have not done well. But what I'm here to say is that they can do it. It's just that it has not been the popular approach to building these systems the way that I'm discussing it now, but people are coming around to that because that's how you get it to work. So that is happening. And then you'll be able to have, your CMO will be able to ask of its agent any deep technical question about the technical software it's selling. Like we have, Gerard is our CMO at Vivun, and he's like excellent with this product, right? And you can ask these things and like, is this an accurate way of representing the value prop? And the agent can give him a response that we feel is good and not a liability, right? Because that's the other thing is like, as soon as you start using AIs to answer these important high stakes questions, it's not enough that that it has to just be right. If it's wrong, it becomes a liability. That becomes a real risk for businesses. So you gotta know that this thing is grounded in the expert knowledge, in the right way of thinking about the world, and your domain specifically.
Yeah, I really like that example. And I was just trying to think of, where can marketers start in partnering and making sure that they're setting up AI initiatives that are going to work. And I went back to something you said earlier on the dashboards because you're like everybody wants to see the data. They want to see what's working, what's not. But the problem that has always existed with dashboards is it's hindsight. Like
Right.
hindsight here is how we can measure these outcomes. And if you start to look at what didn't work and layer on knowledge plus hindsight results and ask the questions of what, like, I always say, like, look at the 80%. So 20%, seems pretty good from a pipeline conversion standpoint. Um, but what happened with the 80%, and where are there opportunities, and get qualitative and quantitative data. Ask people what happened with these 80%. What knowledge can we codify out of our losses, and where can we spend some more time in trying to uncover what we don't know and bring in the right people who might have the answers or might have a different perspective.
Yeah.
What are some ways that you help people kind of get off the ground and prioritize, like, where do we start? Who do we need in the room?
Like this is why I think everybody should be like a scientist. It is there's a really good just basic process of like the scientific method that applies universally to the way that we should be running businesses as well. And we do it, and we do the same thing at Vivun and any company I've ever been part of. We do the same thing. It's just to say when you start out a thing, you got to call a shot. You got to, we call it a hypothesis in science, but it's like you just got to call a shot. You can't just go out and do something random. You have to say, this is what our intention is. This is what we think will happen. This is what we're going to go do. And then, I'll borrow some lessons that I learned from Bridgewater. But if you start out with your goal there, and then you kind of go into what we call like a machine, or like Ray used to call a machine, and that's like there's a process that you're going to run, and there's people that are going to run that process. And you just have to see, did I get the process right? Do I have the right people in this machine? That machine turns, it produces an outcome, and you can just compare it to what you thought you had. And the things that you can change are the people or the process. And when you really are rigorous about that, that's just like the scientific method as well. So it's not like Ray invented it, but it's a useful way of thinking about how you should be running, especially in AI in these projects, because there's a lot of black box nature of things here. Where
Mhm.
like if you can't do that, uh, you have to ask yourself, like, what are you even doing? Like, how can you improve if you can't go through that process, that step, and then compare your outcomes and then do something about it to affect it deterministically? What can you do? So I see a lot of people like, they're just using Chat GPT, and you're like, you got it wrong. What are you gonna do next? Like, you don't know why it's wrong. You can't control the LLM. You can prompt it differently, but the prompt is only one very small piece of this giant machine that is the LLM. So, like, what are you going to do? So I think that like making sure that people understand, like, especially in this world where like AI is really starting to take over a lot of the, is like starting to be a big part of a lot of the machines that we run in business. You've really got to be careful to break it down and make sure that you're like, do I understand exactly what's happening here? Can I make a change that will increase the probability that my outcome is the cold shot that I had? Like, is this a deterministic function, or am I just actually kind of out here being random? Because that's more often than not the thing that I see the most, is that people just haven't spent the time to like really define this process. And so as a result, like I think it's really tough for them to learn.
Yeah, I agree. And you're hitting on the importance of being iterative, even starting small.
Yep.
So when you're looking at data and you're seeing all these big opportunities, prioritizing based on time to value and what what do you understand, what can you impact is really important because I don't think people take the time to get into those steps in the process. You know, they're like, I did think about it. I looked at this report. I heard this feedback. Actually reminds me a lot of even some very good salespeople where when I was in product, they'd come back and they're like, if we just added these two features, everyone's going to say, yes, I can sell this like hotcakes. You just got to do these two features.
I've heard those same talks.
Yeah. And you're, as a product person, you're like, okay, what's the big challenge that's solving? Uh,
Yep.
how would they define success? And the salespeople sometimes will race ahead and make some assumptions. But what you really have to do as someone who is leading an initiative, as someone who is leading product development or using AI, is make sure you're very clear on the core problem, the challenge, and you've gotten it down small enough that you can start to test and iterate in a short amount of time to prove out the value.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and like as last point on this, I guess, but it's when I talk about like the importance of building this world model outside of the LLM, this is like it's the same thing we're talking about. Like there's a cold shot, and it is like, what is the reasoning that I have codified into this world model? So when I say buyer versus user, I have defined those terms in this graph. And then I can do something about that. That gives me an enormous amount of power, because then if the agent makes the mistake that confuses the two, I can go back and I could say, like, why did it confuse? Oh, my definition of these two things is too similar. Let me be more precise about what I mean. I mean, this is the same thing that happens with amongst humans. Like, when we get fights with our partners or whatever, it's like almost always people always like throw this term out like, oh, it's just semantics. And you're like, the irony of that is unbelievable. Like,
Yeah.
Of course, it's just semantics. Semantics is the meaning of words. It is the foundation of our thought. So if you're not being clear about your semantics, yeah, you're going to fight. You're going to be confused. You're going to talk past each other. So like it's really, really important to be able to define these things so that when you get it wrong, you can go back and say, ah, it's because this is murky. Let me define these better and separate them more. So like they're more clear about what I mean, or my intentionality of that is more clear. That will help the LLM, and it also, helps your personal relationships.
I agree. So we're at time that flew, went over 30 minutes, but it's
Good time.
good and great. And I hope that everybody is walking away understanding a few really key things. One, the hype is real. AI is disrupting the way that we do work, but that doesn't mean that there aren't challenges to solve. And I hope that coming out of this conversation, you feel empowered to be bold, but take the time to do those definitions, to get deep into the process, pull in the right people, and have that. I love that call the shot. Like,
Yeah.
get clear so that you are leading efforts that not only give people the opportunity to build new skills, solve different types of problems, but empower sales teams, marketing teams in ways that have never been possible before. Joseph, before we end, is there anything else you want to add or close out with?
I would just say that I think that there's a lot of anxiety around the future of what AI is going to be, how they're going to disrupt our companies, how they already are disrupting our companies. And I think that that's a valid thing to be concerned of. And I think that especially the business leaders that are listening to this podcast, like it is a thing that we should be having in the front of our minds. And we should be actively thinking, how do we be empathetic through this process? But the process is going to happen. This is real. It is really happening. I am seeing it in every domain that I've been blessed enough to touch here. It is really, really dramatic and very exciting. But it will require some human leadership, I think, to navigate the companies empathetically through this process. So I'd encourage everybody to stay up on the reading, understand where the human values are, and help us shape these things so that the AIs come out more human, and it's less them versus us and just more of us.
Yes.
So,
Oh,
and
okay.
thanks for everybody listening.
Yep. And if you want to hear more episodes of Leader Generation, you can find them at modop.com. That's modop.com. And until next time, have a great week, Joseph.
See you guys.